That's right. It only has like a 30 right. And it was sunny all weekend. Sunny, beautiful weather.
Yeah, so we're going to sort of for any particular reason.
Take your attention real quick. We're going to start in a few moments. We have started the live stream, so the microphones you see above your head is capturing all your messages.
Hey, good to see you, Harley.
Be mindful.
Is there a particular order we should
Do you have an order you want to say?
No, absolutely not. Wherever you feel comfortable.
You should sit there if you're
Take a picture?
I'm just commenting slash asking questions. Oh, really?
According to the TikTok.
They make some money.
Make it quick.
So wow, streaming really shut the room up, huh?
Rather being overheard.
To the internet, how are you doing? That camera right there is our internet camera. We'll be starting in about another minute. So feel free to talk amongst yourselves. Only things that are publicly digested.
Why you hear your own channel first?
That's it. We all multitask here. Do I have your permission to post this?
Yes.
We all look very
Sure.
All right, we're ready to start. I just want to say thank you all so very much for coming. I'm Nuala O'Connor. I'm the president and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, and showing my incredible bias towards my alma mater. We're thrilled to be partnering with the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton for this event, and hopefully many more in the future. Thank you guys for being here. We've got a terrific event, so that's my entire job, is to say welcome and thank you for being part of the dialogue. And I'm going to turn it over to our Chief Technologist, Joe Lorenzo Hall.
Thank you to everyone for coming. This was this event filled up within 24 hours of our posting it, and so we necessarily are live streaming so that folks who couldn't make the event or who may not be able to join us this time can watch it. A little bit of housekeeping. There's Wi-Fi over here on the whiteboard. CDT guest, Big Brother is watching in camel case, so every word starts with a capital letter. We are live streaming it, and it will be available on CDT's YouTube channel afterwards for you to look at. I do suggest if you're going to tweet, we use CPNI Tech as a hashtag for the Twitter back channel. There are microphones in the ceiling, so this means a few things. One, take time to mute your devices so that we don't get extraneous noises. It can be really hard for remote attendees to hear if people are all talking at once. There's a seat down in the front if you'd like to sit. There may not be any other seat at this point. She's there. We have a friend. We're all about consumer choice, and you sit right there. And you may want to pass notes instead of whispering to folks, because I'm not sure what the microphones will pick up, but it's on you if it picks it up. So as I think we all know, the FCC is engaged in some rulemaking around Section 222 specific to broadband privacy right now. And this can be an extremely difficult area of tech policy to wrap your head around, both the law and the technology. There are a number of technical topics that are really important for the policymaking community. And if you're in this room, you're probably part of the policymaking community, or you're a supreme masochist. The key technical topics here are things related to identifiers, device identifiers. This relates to sort of the NPRM's use of proprietary information and CPNI and PII as subsets of that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then crypto and encryption is another one, and then network inspection technologies, things like deep packet inspection technologies. So let me introduce folks real quickly, and I'll talk about our format. And I'm not going to do anything with their bios because they're all extremely famous, and you can Google them very easily and learn about them on your own. And as I know, having people read your bio back to you is a certain kind of hell. So we won't do that. We have Laura Moy from Georgetown University here, all the way to your left. Peter Swire from Georgia Tech. Harlan Yu from Upturn. Nick Feemster from Princeton University. Jim Halpert from DLA Piper. And Richard Bennett from the American Enterprise Institute. The format here is going to be really strange. This is not your typical panel. We're trying our best to move away from panels, and so this is kind of an experiment. You'll have to bear with us. We're going to do 3 30-minute sessions on each of these topics. So starting with identifiers, then going to encryption, and then going to network inspection or deep packet inspection technologies. The format within those 30 minutes, you'll have a technical person do a level set, basically talk to you about the particular kind of technology there. Then we'll have technical perspectives on that particular type of technology, and you'll see some of us who are doing the level setting actually contribute there as well. And then finally, we'll have some policy reactions from folks on the panel. And then we'll have 10 minutes per session for audience interaction. I'm gonna moderate rather brutally, so please forgive me because we don't have a lot of time. This is a pretty fast-paced environment, so I will press you to make a point rather quickly. But feel free to push back if there's something that you really feel needs to be said. And finally, this event is made possible by the very generous support from the Princeton University Jerome C. Bloom Memorial Fund, established by Ron Lee, who's here in the second row. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Ron. In honor of Jerome C. Blum, professor of history at Princeton University, who taught at Princeton from 1947 to 1981. I encourage you to read up about Jerome. It's a totally fascinating life story there. Anyway, so let's start with identifiers. So I'm going to level set on identifiers here. The current proposed rule would protect consumer proprietary information, something called CPI, which consists of CPNI, the statutory definition of consumer proprietary network information, and something called personally identifiable information. And the proposed definition of personally identifiable information is actually somewhat of a big tent for PII. It includes any information that is linked or linkable to an individual. This directly implicates some of the identifiers that exist in sort of network and computer information technologies. There are a number of these that we should talk about here in this room, and some are called out specifically in the text of the NPRM. So, for example, IP addresses. An IP address is a network identifier at the Internet Protocol layer that allows the Internet to route information to specific devices that have that IP address. They can be dynamically allocated or they can be fixed. So this means that when you make a connection, you may receive an IP address that is rather stable or one that changes with some regularity. A dynamically allocated IP address may be linkable to a subscriber or an individual, as the rule actually used, if there's some mapping kept between the IP address allocation and an account identifier or something that actually identifies the particular individual. Fixed IP addresses tend to be stable over a longer period of time, and those, by nature of being stable over a much longer time, are sort of naturally linkable or linked to an individual. MAC addresses, so this is another kind of network identifier that works at a different layer of the internet, so to speak. Your Wi-Fi or your, if you ever plug your computer into an Ethernet cable, the way the local network is routing information is somewhat similar to how IP information is routed. And the interesting thing about MAC addresses is that the MAC address shouldn't leave your local network. It shouldn't go up through your network to the ISP or to the access provider itself. There are cases in which it might flow, and in the future, there may be types of technologies where you no longer have a cable modem or a DSL modem or a fiber modem, and your access provider may actually be handing out these local network addresses, a MAC address, in a way that the access network may have access to that identifier. Not saying they will do anything with it, but they may have access to it. There's a set of other identifiers, device identifiers, so things that identify a mobile device. So there's things like Ad ID on the Android platform, IDFA, the identifier for advertisers on the iOS platform. There are cookie values. I think many of us are familiar with those kinds of things. If it is a unique cookie value, so not something that just specifies, say, the language that you prefer or something like that, the NPRM implicates that. There's a bunch of other ones like, I don't know how to say this, eponymous things that relate to your name identifiers. So like, for example, I use Joe Hall pretty much everywhere. There are property identifiers that calls out, so license plate numbers, which is totally fascinating that you see that in the telecom NPRM. There's some of the things that aren't specifically included. So one I want to highlight is ISP applied identifiers, like the Verizon's unique identifier header, the UIDH, which is applied to unencrypted mobile traffic on the web. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff it calls out that I consider sort of linkable information. So browsing history, traffic statistics, app usage data, current or historical geolocation. All those things don't identify you, but they could, with other information, be linked to you. For example, your geolocation information, it shows that you spend a lot of time with this address that happens to be your home. There's probably a pretty easy way to link it to you. So I'll conclude, and we'll go with some technical perspectives. The things that sort of that come out to me when I think about identifiers are persistence. To what extent is this thing going to always be the same identifier over many, many sessions that you're interacting with the web service or internet service of some sort? Linkability, is it explicit, like your social security number or a telephone number, something that is more directly associated with your identity, or implicit in the sense that it requires some other information or other inference to actually do that stuff? And finally, controllable by the user. To what extent can the user reset a given identifier or change it, or essentially come up with a different identity, so to speak, associated with that identifier? Okay, so I'll spend a few minutes. Did I get that right? Did I get that wrong? Technical folks, and Harlan, Nick, and Richard, if you have any thoughts on identifiers, please.
Yeah, there seems to be sort of an inverse relationship between the persistence of network identifiers and the scope over which they travel. MAC addresses are probably the most persistent feature of all the network identifiers, because a MAC address is delivered in a product in a programmable read-only memory, and then it's programmed into the Ethernet chip or the Wi-Fi chip, and you pretty much always have, the device pretty much always uses the same MAC address. I mean, you really have to go out of your way to not use it. But as you said, it doesn't travel outside the local network. So you have a MAC address, an IP packet will have a MAC address of the original device as it moves towards the home router. But then the home router, as it forwards it up to the access network, will replace that MAC address with its MAC address. And then, then they shoot it up. So it's not that valuable outside the scope of data collection within the home network. IP addresses are, well, most IP addresses in access networks are dynamically assigned by DHCP. All the ones I've observed, which is mainly Comcast, tend to be assigned for very long periods of time, like a year. I mean, there's a reassignment process that takes place in DHCP periodically, but you always end up with the same address. But then as you move, into things like user IDs and sort of user linkable information, and these network identifiers are not really user linkable. They don't tell us who's using the machine, because the network doesn't care about that.
Individual, yes.
So the individual who's the one that has, shopping preferences, you have to get into like the sort of more user-focused identifiers to unlock that down for her.
Harlan, Nick, any thoughts?
I have two main thoughts. One, I think relevant to this debate is what ISPs or how ISPs use identifiers, or how they can link their subscribers' traffic to their identities. And I think the answer there is basically always. It doesn't really matter necessarily what technology is behind how the identifiers work necessarily. If an ISP has a subscriber and the subscriber is using the internet, that ISP knows who that subscriber is, right? Has to give access, the user has to pay, maybe their data caps. The ISP will know whose traffic is going over their network between that particular subscriber and the first entry point into the network. So to that extent, things are persistent, and necessarily so, because that's what happens when you subscribe to internet service. But I think the second issue here is what ISPs might do to enable other third parties to track users. So we saw with the Verizon super cookies issue that Joe alluded to, the fact that Verizon was essentially injecting into the user's traffic a identifier that relatively permanently identified that particular subscriber to other third parties on the web who wanted to track them. So the ISP was basically acting as an enabler based on what it knew inside the network to enable others outside who might have less permanent identifiers, to enable them to track subscribers more permanently and over longer periods of time.
Can you explain injection real quick?
Sure. Right. So, and apologies in advance for the hoarseness. I'm just getting over a cold. What ISPs, what Verizon had been doing is when a Verizon subscriber was, using the data network, let's say browsing the web on a mobile device, the user, sends packets back and forth with a web server, but obviously the ISP is the intermediary who routes those packets back and forth between the user and web servers. In that process, the ISP will look at a number of pieces of header information to know, where that packet came from. There's source information, there's destination information, but there's a number of other attributes in those headers, like the length of the packet and a whole bunch of other things. Basically, what Verizon was doing, it was adding a new field to that packet header, where it said, here's the special Verizon advertising header, here's the unique number, and no matter what packet was being sent or what site the user was going to, that specific identifier was being injected and added to those packets for the sites that had essentially the partner advertiser that Verizon was working with, and for all of that traffic. And that was something that was not transparent to the user that was happening. It was only discovered by security researchers a little time after, or perhaps a few months already after that behavior was already happening. So at least from the consumer perspective, that seemed pretty surreptitious in what the ISP was doing in helping other third parties track subscribers over longer periods of time.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Feel free to.
No.
Okay. Nick, do you want to say?
Sure. I wanted to come back to your sort of discussion about identifiers and actually talk a little bit about catalog of identifiers. Most of those are things that are evident when you do things like deep packet inspection, and I guess there's 30 minutes that we'll talk about that. But I think it's sort of worth recognizing that deep packet inspection is not the beginning or the end of the story necessarily. Comcast, for example, said in various venues that DPI only covers something like less than 10% of their subscriber base. So I think there's a lot of sort of panic about DPI, and that's certainly one part of the story, but it's a little bit of a red herring. So we'll have a discussion about DPI and crypto, but I think it's important to keep in mind that that's just one sort of piece of the story. What I wanted to kind of focus my comments on with respect to identifiers is really where else do identifiers show up and what identifiers show up. So in lieu of a slide, I basically created this to level set.
So in front of you have a piece of paper that is my effort to make sure we don't have to show a slide.
Yeah, so I won't go through the whole thing here, but basically this is a little bit of an attempt to organize some of my thoughts about where other, what types of data ISPs collect, and how they use it, and when it, how it might be used for security and performance reasons. We can talk about when, where, and with whom it might be shared.
And security performance is sort of under the umbrella of network management.
Network management, exactly. Most of the rows here really involve IP addresses as an identifier, with the exception of the last two rows. DPI, of course, has all the, many of the things you talked about. SNMP, the byte counters have essentially almost nothing.
What's SNMP?
That's basically a protocol that allows a network manager or a network operator to get a lot of information out of a network device. One of the things that it allows an operator to get is the number of bytes that have traversed an interface. And typically this is polled at 5-minute intervals, so you get things like usage statistics.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see not per IP address, but you can just see basically how much traffic has gone across this link. Depending on where that's deployed, it might be more or less identifying. So I think basically that's something to keep in mind. Is there when we talk about identifiers and the types of data at the disposal of ISPs, there are different types of data collected at different granularities for different purposes, and there are various instances where that data might be shared. Some of which there's a wide variety of reasons, I guess we might say. But I think we want to point out that there are also legitimate reasons for sharing some of this data. If we particularly look at that second column, in terms of the use of some of this data for security and performance, a lot of ISPs share data with third parties, such as Arbor Networks, Damballa, other companies who basically do threat detection, mitigation, and so forth. Also, as a researcher, I'd like to point out that ISPs often share data with researchers, and there are several studies that we have done, including one that we just announced yesterday on interconnection, that probably wouldn't be possible, if the current rules went down as proposed. That being said, there are also privacy risks that I think we need to be explicit about, and I also think we'll have a 30-minute discussion there. I think encryption is not totally the end of the story. We still have to be careful about what privacy risks exist in some of this data.
Jim, Peter, Laura, would you like to give us some policy perspective?
I got a tick list of 4 or 5 things that I can do quickly. So part of this is around identifiers, what's better for privacy and for consumers. The first thing is that the definition that we've heard described is closer to the EU approach to what's personal data. It's a broader take on what counts as identifiable. And so people who've lived through the European regime can have views on how workable that is. One of the things that's hard in Europe, and this is the second point, is that IP addresses are clearly considered personal data in Europe. However, your security logs always have IP addresses, and your logs in general always have IP addresses. And so Europe has had this sort of schizophrenic problem where they try to pretend it's not really personal data so you can run your systems, but it is personal data with all the consent and other requirements because it's personal data. And it's been difficult in practice to know how to resolve that. So if you go broad, you run into some of these operational problems. Third point is, does the definition give good incentives to de-identify data or put it into aggregate form? If you go too broad in your definition, then even stuff that's sort of there for analytic purposes or de-identified purposes might be considered re-identifiable if you did the following complicated things. If that's true, if you say even that counts as personal data, then a bunch of the analysis doesn't happen. And there might be better privacy protections to allow pretty solid organizational technical controls around data, analyze it, and consider that okay without saying all of that's in the realm of individual consent. The fourth thing is when you're thinking of privacy effects for the data, such as the advertising IDs that every app can see, is how much is this an ISP data thing versus lots of other people data thing. So there's privacy risks from any organization having all that. If you're going to regulate, are you regulating the whole field? Are you regulating part of the field? How do you think about that? The fifth point is just to echo the researcher point. I testified for the workshop last year in April about there not being a researcher exception in ECPA and some of these things. And if we don't do that, we close down Nick Feimster, which would be a bad thing.
Sure, yeah, I'll just add a couple points. So a couple things. one is that I think one of the things that stands out to me about Nick's chart and about this discussion in general, that I think is important to remember as we approach this issue from a policy perspective, is that consumers have to share this information. It does have utility in terms of operation of the network. I mean, there are reasons that ISPs have to collect this information from their subscribers. There are reasons that they have to use it, and that subscribers have to provide it, therefore, so that they can get service. So oftentimes consumers have no choice but to share information that potentially either is sensitive with respect to their personal communications or could be analyzed to reveal sensitive information. They have no choice but to do that if they want to connect to the internet. And I think that as a kind of like, as a level setting point, I think that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind as we approach all of this. We have a clear policy goal, policy interest as a society in getting everyone connected. And in order for people to get connected, they have to provide information about their communications. I also, a couple other thoughts. One is that with respect to de-identification of these various types of data, I think it's important to remember that re-identification is a constantly developing technology. So successful de-identification is a moving target. And so what looks like a successful de-identification standard today may not be a successful de-identification standard a year or two from now as the technology develops. And just a quick response to Peter's point, with respect to what the incentives are for ISPs to de-identify consumer information. I mean, regardless of what the consent standard is that applies to subscriber information, ISPs ought to have an incentive to de-identify the records that they store to the extent that it is feasible for them to do so, because they have an obligation, obviously, to maintain the data in a secure state. And the more easily re-identifiable the information is, the less secure it is, the more susceptible to privacy breach in the event of an actual data breach. And then, sorry, and I know that my time is running short, but one more point that I would want to raise is that I think thinking about UIDH, I think it's an interesting case study, in part because it reminds us that it is very difficult to separate out privacy from information security. So you could view the inclusion of the UIDH header without consumers' consent as a violation of consumer privacy, of consumers' expectations without consumers' consent. But because the ISP in that case included the header and stated that it did not intend for that piece of data to be usable by third parties to track to track the online activities of its subscribers, and it just turned out to be used that way. You could also look at it as an engineering failure, as a failure of the ISP to take reasonable measures to prevent the inclusion of that header from presenting a breach of customers' browsing activities to unauthorized third parties. And I will stop there.
Perfect.
Well, and I have a few observations as well. First of all, the idea that consumers need to provide this information when they go online. Consumers, anytime they send an email, are revealing their IP address. And this is true of virtually every internet function. And what's really bizarre about the CP&I discussion is we're zooming in great detail, particularly on what ISPs do, without considering that just the way the internet works, and that there are all sorts of other communications that contain all this information that would not be subject to a unique regulatory framework. And we need to think about consistency and what's appropriate, I think, broadly on the internet. And I think the CP&I NPRM is particularly striking in assuming that IP addresses and MAC addresses are sensitive information, and that they require a security breach notice anytime there's any unauthorized access to that information, even if the person who obtains access can't do anything with those data. And this regulatory framework is so far off of the way that American information security law and also privacy law function that I think we're getting a little too wound up in what is going on in this particular corner of the universe. The IP address without all the browsing data is really not sensitive information, I think, in any way, shape, or form. It's something that is passed along on the internet. It's all over the place. And I think we really need to hone in and think carefully about what is sensitive before we then have a discussion about what would be subject to any sort of opt-in rule, because we're not in Europe, we're in the United States, and opt-out rules are the way that we've dealt as a country with the collection and use of and disclosure of this information on, for years. And so what we're, I think, in the end, talking about with this proceeding is, should we strap on a uniquely heavy-duty set of rules for a huge range of information, only a small percentage of which is sensitive, simply because the ISP obtains it. Also, the discussion about consumers needing to give up this information to communicate on the internet is in no way correlates to any proven consumer concern about signing up for internet service by virtue of obtaining this. And there's another feature of Peter's report, which is, I think, very interesting, that consumers will typically log into the internet from multiple ISPs in the course of a day, from a Wi-Fi provider at work, at home, potentially multiple Wi-Fi providers, so that the view that the ISP has of surfing habits of a consumer can actually be quite limited compared to a place in the internet where a subscriber has been signed on all day across multiple devices. And the whole issue about cross-device identification is, sort of a similar issue to this one, but this proceeding would launch in and regulate in a super heavy-duty way that's inconsistent with the whole U.S. privacy framework, simply because an ISP had obtained the information. I think it's worth taking a step back and thinking about how the U.S. framework works as a whole and what information really is sensitive such that it would merit an opt-in or a breach notice requirement.
Cool. So that was us. You must have questions. I'm going to do the educated thing. Oh, Joe, I don't have to. Go for it.
This definitely is an educated question. I guess you guys were hitting on this. How, with the NPRM as it's presented, how would you propose reworking the definition of PII, CPNI, PI? And what would you strip out, or what would you? I'm just trying to right now grapple with what you would tell the FCC.
The FCC is very narrowly focused on the element of the internet which is clearly under their jurisdiction, which is, the access providers. But if you want to collect big troves of information about what people are doing on the internet, the best thing to be is a browser. Because browsers have access to everything you do, and they have it in clear text. Whereas ISPs have access to a lot of stuff that's encrypted, that they can't make any sense out of, and they've got other problems, than mining that information for things that can be sold to advertisers. And the other thing is the overall focus to limit the collection and sale of personally identifiable information, or to protect that information from access by bad actors? Because, bear in mind, the economic model of the web is totally advertising based, right? And I don't know if anyone else thinks there are too many ads on the internet, but that's sort of my perception. And I have to believe that if the ads were more narrowly, specifically focused, they would be more valuable, and we wouldn't need to have so many of them. So I think they're solving the problem that they're able to solve, or addressing the problem they're able to solve, but it's like that drunk in the car keys under the streetlight kind of thing. It's not really the problem that users have with advertising on the internet.
Anyone else?
Yeah, if I could just respond really briefly to that and just say, I think, both those points and some of the points that Jim made, I think underscore something that is often missed in some of these discussions, which is that some of these are good arguments for stronger privacy protections across the board, right? If we're concerned that regulating the privacy obligations of ISPs closely consistent with what the statute requires, not just what the FCC is able to do, but also with what the FCC is mandated to do based on the language of the Communications Act. If we're concerned that that does not fully get at some of consumers' privacy concerns with respect to, for example, browsers or for example, other actors on the internet generally, then those are really good arguments for regulators to think about what the privacy concerns might be with respect to some of the other actors in the environment, and to try maybe to create new legislation or to come up with new regulations that would apply to some of those other actors in a way that does raise the bar for consumer privacy across the board. But but the fact that there are other privacy concerns that consumers are facing does not negate the need for privacy protections that apply to some of the actors that have access to a lot of information and are situated to do things like inject unique identifiers into subscribers' traffic without their consent or even knowledge.
But I'd like to frame this a little bit more specifically. The question is not whether there should be privacy protections. There were privacy protections before the net neutrality order. There will be privacy protections under FCC rules. The question is, what privacy regulations are appropriate for what information or what behavior? And it's not an all or nothing choice of the FCC's NPRM proposal, nor is that the definition of CI, which includes these IP addresses and device identifiers, is found absolutely nowhere in the federal statute. This is a proposal, I think, probably based on some suggestions that came to the commission, but it has very far-reaching information security implications, for example, by focusing ISPs on securing and having super tight breach notice deadlines around the mere access to an IP address, and really needs to be thought through. And so this is not an all or nothing choice. The question is how to get it right.
Where you finished?
Yeah, I can stop there.
Nick, did you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, to the question too, I think it's two thoughts. One is it seems important to be clear on the goals. What information are we interested in protecting and from who? And I think it's sort of, there's certainly a tension between, just echoing the discussion I had with Peter earlier, what's possible versus what's plausible, okay? And how that information is used and who it's shared with, I think, is really at the crux of the issue. So we could take some of the information, like some of the examples that I listed in my response to Peter about what can you learn from traffic, right? So even bearing in mind the removal of identifiers and end-to-end crypto and things like that, and things we've done in our own research, you can figure out how many devices are on the home network. You can figure out their usage patterns. So based on that, you might be able to figure out, is someone home? Are they away? Are they awake? Are they asleep? These kind of things might be
important information.
Yeah, these things might be very useful also for securing the network, right? If you have some crazy IoT device going wild in the home, that might be actually kind of useful information to see anomalous traffic patterns. On the other hand, you could imagine, some of that inferred data being potentially misused. So I think the question really is it should be not so much what can we see and what can we infer, but what's plausible to sort of infer, and what are the risks of to consumers with regards to who has access to that and how it might be shared. Well, because there are plenty of legitimate uses as well.
Well, and I think that there's just, one could also say functionally what is happening. So if, for example, normally one approaches advertising based on somebody's health status as an activity that requires opt-in consent, one can advertise using other information that would, yes, in theory, and a company might have access to the health information, but if they don't use that information, then normally, for example, or similarly to monitor what's going on in people's homes and who's awake, those sorts of uses might be subject to a different set of requirements than simply because that information might be included and might be used at some
So
point.
how it's going to be used, I think, is important to spell out.
Makes a lot of sense. We'll take one more question on this chunk and then we'll move on. Or we could just move on. Okay, let's talk about crypto.
Cool. So I'm going to do a very quick level set on encryption and its relevance to this debate. I only have 5 minutes, and there's actually a ton to cover here. So especially in
You
getting
can
to
squeeze DPI a little bit, that's on you.
the technical explainer. Okay, so I'll first point out that my organization, we wrote a report that came out in March called What ISPs Can See, which is the basis of a lot of what I'll be talking about here. So if you just Google for what ISPs can see, upturn, you'll find the report. So the use of encryption on the internet does make a practical difference in terms of what ISPs can eventually see about subscribers' traffic. And I'll just make 2 key points here. So first is that while the use of encryption is increasing on the web and on other protocols on the internet, in my opinion, pervasive encryption is still a very long ways off. And there are lots of good reasons to believe that that's the case for many structural reasons. So first off, when encryption is not used, what can an ISP see? So this might sound basic, but when encryption is not used, the ISP can see the content of all of the traffic that traverses the network from the subscriber. So this includes not just the header information, but all of the data and the payload, the actual text of the website that the user is visiting. If in case of email traffic, if that traffic is not encrypted, an ISP could potentially even read all of that content, all of that email. But increasingly, it is the case that web services are encrypting the traffic between subscribers and their services. And major websites are doing this more and more frequently. So obviously when you see like the green lock icon in your web browser, that means that particular session, all of that is encrypted, and the ISP can't see the content of that transmission. But it's also the case that while major websites are shifting toward using and adopting HTTPS, there's a long tail of other websites that subscribers go to that are still not encrypted and may not be encrypted for quite a long time. So as part of our report that we put out in March, we did a quick scan of the Alexa top 50 websites in health and news and shopping. And based on our quick scan, in each of these 3 categories, for the top 50 sites in each of the 3 categories, more than 85% in each category, where if you browsed, just a random page on that site, let's say even in health, 85% of those pages would be transmitted unencrypted, which means that the ISP could see exactly which web page you're looking at. So if you're on webmd.com, which is unencrypted, and you're looking at liver disease, the ISP could see exactly the URL of the web page and even the contents of all the web page that you're looking at. So that is certainly concerning. And so the question is, okay, well, WebMD can very quickly and easily, like all the other major websites, transition to HTTPS. What's the problem? We're going to get there in a couple years. But the hard part about this is for any given website like WebMD to transition to HTTPS, it actually has WebMD actually has a number of dependencies on third-party services that are also operating on that website. So in order for WebMD to actually deliver you the full site, it's not just the content that comes from WebMD, but there's a number of other third-party dependencies that load when you load a WebMD site. So as third-party advertisers, that has analytic providers, it might have embedded videos. It actually pulls together content from a bunch of different places in order to provide you one website. And in order for WebMD to go fully HTTPS, it must be the case that all of the third-party providers that they rely on are also HTTPS. If even one of their providers aren't HTTPS, the site isn't fully secure, and you're going to get a browser warning. You won't get that green log icon. So for many websites, like the 85% that we saw during our scan, it's really hard for these sites to transition because these sites are basically waiting for the third-party partners to move over to HTTPS. And we can talk later in the policy discussion about incentives for third parties to do that, et cetera. The second key point I will make here and then pass things over is that even when HTTPS is used by services, ISPs can learn quite a lot about characteristics about users. ISPs can still see the domains that subscribers are visiting. So even though, so let's say hypothetically that webmd.com was encrypted, did use HTTPS on its website, even though the ISP couldn't see necessarily that the user was looking at liver disease specifically, could still tell that the user is looking at webmd.com. So webmd.com might be only slightly revealing in that, okay, the subscriber is looking up a medical ailment. But domain names in general are actually quite sensitive and can be quite revealing by themselves. So let's consider this series of domains. You have a subscriber, and over a short period of time, the user looks at abortionfacts.com, plannedparenthood.org, dcabortionfund.org, and maps.google.com. What does that tell us about what the subscriber might be looking at, right? This is just a very small snippet of what the DNS log that the ISP could see. But I think it should be pretty obvious to everyone that it can be highly sensitive and highly revealing. And so people might call these DNS queries just metadata in that with the implication that metadata is not sensitive. But I think it's obvious that this certainly isn't the case, and especially over a long period of time, over a series of weeks and months, the ISP could build up, just using domains, a relatively good sense for who this user is, what the consumer's interests are and habits are, what demographics, and other sensitive information that could be used to potentially target advertising toward vulnerable consumers. So I think that is quite a concern. My last point here, well, it's not really a point. I was going to explain how basically the DNS system works, which
30 seconds.
I don't know if that's necessary. Maybe I'll save that in case people wonder. But essentially,
It works pretty well.
the bottom line here is that whenever you type a URL into your web browser, nytimes.com, at some point, your computer needs to figure out, okay, what's the actual IP address that nytimes.com basically translates to. It's basically addressing address book of the internet. So for any domain name that your computer needs to reach, it's going to send out a DNS query over the network, and all of those DNS queries are unencrypted. Sometimes it's actually the ISP, often by default, the ISP is the actual resolver, which means the ISP is giving you the responses, which means it's very easy for them to potentially collect all of these DNS queries, thereby, all of the the domain names that the user is visiting. But even if the user is not using the ISP's resolver and uses a third-party resolver, all of those requests still have to go through the user's ISP, which means the ISP could still collect all of that unencrypted domain name traffic. So I'll stop there.
Nick, Rich?
I'll follow on to that. I'm glad Harlan talked about DNS because that's actually where I wanted to pick up. I think it's a great canonical example of sort of the sort of two sides of the coin in terms of it's a great example of traffic that ISPs often use to detect malware, bots, and so forth. There's a lot of research and even companies that have been founded on looking at the DNS lookups to detect that kind of information. We did
Is there a toy sketch of that you could do for us?
Yeah, so basically, let's suppose you have a device that's, I'll give you two examples. Common example is an infected device, right? Typically, that device is going to join, shall we say, a large army of other infected devices that will mount maybe a large denial of service attack or something else. In order to coordinate those compromised devices, attackers often use what's called a botnet, which has a command and control machine that basically issues commands to all of its minions, if you will, the compromised devices. in order to phone home.
Forth my pretties.
Yeah, exactly. So in order to phone home, the compromised devices typically have to look up they have to phone home to this command and control. And that's often done it's typically done using the domain name system. The domain names that are often used for those are usually throwaway domains, things that attackers register, at the last minute, usually like in bulk. So we've done a lot of work in looking at, there's some great work from Georgia Tech actually looking at how DNS lookups can be used to detect compromised devices. We've also looked at how attackers register domains, which isn't right there in the traffic that ISPs see, but other registrars have that information. You can see, you can do early attack detection from domain name registration and so forth. On the other hand, there are absolutely two sides to the coin. So I think this is a perfect example of let's be explicit about what's being collected from where, because by the way, lots of people can see the DNS. The ISPs can see the DNS. The operators of authoritative domains can see it. They can't see it necessarily with the consumer IP address unless you're Google and you're running a public DNS resolver or you're using eDNS client subnet. But some other parties can see those client IP addresses too. So we should be clear about that.
DNS is not encrypted, correct?
The DNS is currently not encrypted. Currently. So I think basically being explicit about what's this being used for, how is it, by whom, from where in the network, because where it's collected actually matters, who's it being shared with and why. Because again, these botnet detection companies, et cetera, they're technically third parties. So that's the point about DNS. A couple other points. So this is a crypto session, so DNS unencrypted. I think also it's worth mentioning that in some cases, the end-to-end encryption is a little bit of a red herring. A little bit of my chart there, if you look at that, most of those rows are visible even if we presume end-to-end encryption, right? So the DPI row notwithstanding, pretty much all that other information is available. So I think we have to consider both uses and risks in a discussion that's a little bit orthogonal to crypto. One final point I'll make for now that sort of complements what Harlan said as well is, well, it's true, I think that we can certainly say that end-to-end encryption is becoming more pervasive on many websites. Let's not forget this this IoT firestorm that's happening, and I think it's you don't have to spend too much time reading the news to see some vendor manufacturer basically having, shall we say, non-practices in security and privacy with these devices, traffic being sent completely in the clear. We've analyzed 10 or 20 of these in the lab. Almost none of them use encryption right now. So even if your browser's encrypting, these devices right now are in a pretty sad state.
Which is a much bigger problem.
It's going to be a much bigger problem.
Yeah, so I think it's important to get this to repeat this one fact again, that the amount of information and the sensitivity of the information that ISPs could theoretically get or that they actually get is less than what the browser is. The browser and the web server have more information and always will have more information than the ISP can get. The choice to encrypt or not to encrypt is a choice that's made by the web server and by the browser. It's not a choice that's made by the ISP. If you want to encrypt and the ISP doesn't want you to, tough luck, they can't stop you, other than to cut off your service. The third point is that it's not.
Except for start to list. I had to do that.
End-to-end encryption is not the only kind of HTTPS type stuff. You can also use VPNs. And of course, not that many people use VPNs today because VPNs are very high overhead. But it hasn't been that long ago that people said, well, nobody will ever encrypt websites because the overhead's too high. And then Google just started doing it, and it's like, oh, I guess maybe the overhead wasn't that high, after all. So, and there's this thing called Moore's Law. That means we can do things today that we couldn't do, 5, 10 years ago. And it seems to me that VPNs are going to become very important because of the IoT. Because these IoT devices, I mean, things like little light switch controllers and thermostats, they're so cheaply made, and the people who make them have so little expertise in networking. And bear in mind, one of the implications of an end-to-end network is that every application designer has to be a network expert. And that's really, that's a great ideal, but it really doesn't travel well. And so so the argument for probably the quick and dirty way to secure IoT is through VPNs. Now, if you're going through VPNs and your DNS resolver is inside the virtual private network, the ISP can't see the DNS queries. And also, there is a pending standard in IETF to encrypt DNS queries. So that, that it's like any other aspect of security and privacy on the internet. Somebody identifies a vulnerability, somebody else fixes it. So at the end of the day, ISPs may very well want to catch up with browsers and ad networks in terms of building these dossiers of personal information that can be sold to advertisers and targeting ads, but they're nowhere close as a reality to being in that place. I used to build home routers that were sold to major ISPs. And I can tell you that the only thing that we looked at inside our home routers, other than the stuff that was absolutely necessary to provide internet service, we had an optional, porn filter that people could enable to, to make a G-rated internet for their kids, which we had turned off most of the time because it couldn't make it work. If you just don't have enough CPU cycles inside a home network router to do much more than just simply make the internet service take place, reliably and with reasonably high performance. So you'd have to build ISPs would have to build a really elaborate system where they get some work out of the home router, and many home routers aren't ISP supplied, by the way. It's somewhere inside the ISP network, maybe somewhere inside the transit network, because in principle, transit networks have access to the same sort of information that ISPs have access to, because it's just sort of one more stop in the middle of that end-to-end conversation that takes place between the browser and the web server. So I don't know, I'm not as freaked out about ISPs as I am about the databases that are not secure. Because all this information, whatever information we're collecting, is going to be in a database somewhere. If that database is not secure and it gets penetrated by hackers, whether they're foreign government actors or just somebody else, that's how our credit cards end up for sale on darknet somewhere in Russia.
Okay, you want a quick reaction? 10 seconds.
Quick VPN point. I think basically, speaking about the possible versus the plausible, I think is sort of important here. One is that certainly we could talk about the plausibility of everyone using VPNs, but there's a usability question there. I think not many people use them or find them easy to use today. So making them, if we're going to go down that road, we need to sort of consider ease of use. I think the other thing to point out there quickly is that VPN is not a silver bullet. The traffic still comes out somewhere. There's an end to that VPN tunnel. So either you're going to basically terminate that in some other country and pay some performance cost, or you're going to terminate it in the US and you're back to sort of where you are. And sure, you may have a different IP address there, but if you think that that's the end of the story, we can certainly talk about re-identification, and people have managed to do that with Tor. So I think it's possible to do with VPNs. Again, you have to think about possible versus plausible, but it's definitely not the end of the story.
Yeah, just to add on to that, as Nick was saying, in technical terms, yes, VPNs would provide users with quite a lot of protection. VPNs have been, a thing for decades, but users don't really use it. The glory with, despite its problems, the glory with HTTPS is that users don't have to do anything, right? It's something that the websites themselves can enable, and the users don't need to do anything when browsing the web other than observe that there's a green lock icon to be protected. With VPNs, this is something that users need to subscribe to. They have to pay for oftentimes. If you use a free VPN, you kind of get what you pay for. And
configure it correctly.
You got to configure it correctly. It's something that you need to turn on every single time you open your laptop, start a new browser session. Got to turn on that VPN every time. It's just not
I
You know,
do that, but
from
Yeah, it's wonderful.
on your IoT
But-
devices too.
And if you need to learn more about that, come talk to us. We'll teach you after school.
I mean, from what we know about the adoption of privacy-preserving technologies, the ones that work the best are ones that users don't have to configure and the users don't even ever have to think about. For things that users need to actually do something about, adoption rates are always extremely low. I mean, less than 5% at best, even for the most popular privacy-enhancing technologies.
Okay, let's talk about policy implications, re-crypto. Who wants to start?
I sort of like.
Sorry, did I cut you off?
Can I just add one more point to this? Just
I mean, I
one
don't want
quick-
to cabin you as a technologist. You can even go into the policy.
Just one more quick point is that for subscribers, from a privacy perspective, adopting VPNs doesn't solve their core worry. If they're worried about their ISPs monitoring their traffic, the suggestion that we use VPNs simply passes the buck in the sense that as a subscriber, I would subscribe to my VPN, but then all of the traffic that's sensitive that I'm concerned about, now I need to entrust my VPN provider to also secure, right? They can see everything. They could then see everything that my ISP could see. So to the extent that I'm worried about some entity, an ISP or a VPN provider looking at my traffic, the risks are the same, the concerns are the same. And I might even trust my ISP more because I'm actually paying them money. I might be paying my VPN money as well, but you know, they might not be as established or might not have the reputations that ISPs have. So it's going to be a continuing concern for consumers.
Quick 5-second point here. So coming back to the IoT question too, I think Harlan talked about sort of one end of the VPN tunnel, which is the VPN provider. The other is if we consider IoT, right? Yeah, your browser or your laptop or whatever might have a VPN client, but what about your thermostat or your camera or your whatever? It's probably not going to have a VPN client. That means that side of the VPN tunnel is going to have to be somewhere, maybe on your home router, somewhere. So who's maintaining that side of the tunnel? Either you're going to rely on a user to set that up, not going to happen, or it's going to be your ISP. So I'm not sure it necessarily
Or
gets
it could
you.
be a third party too that sells a security add-on for IoT that works transparently once you install it.
Could be,
Someone
but then you're passing the buck.
So I love crypto stuff. I've been doing crypto for a long time for a non-cryptologist. So I'm really optimistic about how the debate's matured on crypto compared to a year ago. A year ago, the FCC had its workshop on broadband privacy, and some people were saying ISPs see everything, and other people were saying no, they see hardly anything at all. And there were sort of folks talking past each other. And I think we have a lot more information that's agreed on now than we did a year ago. So I was talking to a computer scientist from an Ivy League school 2 weeks ago, and I was saying to this person, you know, ISPs, about half the bits that go through it now are HTTPS. They really don't see it anymore. And the computer scientist said, well, wait a second, don't they see everything? I said, no. And then we walked through the stuff that's in the report. So that it's clear that they don't see everything, that it's not comprehensive. So our report, and Justin Hemmings back there, with your hand, Justin, is one of the co-authors on our report, showed that the share of HTTPS in April of 2 years ago was 13%. And the share of HTTPS going through ISPs through the backbone by this spring was 49%. And it's going up from there. So that's a big change. And Joe loves, you know, he liked that statistic. That's a good statistic. Like to be higher, it might be 60% at the end of the year. So the previous allegations had been ISPs had comprehensive visibility. And with this much encrypted stuff, that's not true. And I think people pretty much stopped using that term. What Harlan correctly said is that encryption is not pervasive. Those were the words he said. And it's not. 50% is like, you know, half empty, half full. You can't be more half empty, half full. So there's been a big shift, but it's not all the way there. We have some information about where the encryption is happening. So our study has a list of the 50 most used websites on the net, and 42 of them use encryption by default or when you log in. So those are the most used websites. Now, Harlan correctly said, well, what about these sites around news and health? The 8 of the top 50 that don't use encryption are news sites. And Wired Magazine ran a story in the last couple of weeks about how they're shifting over to HTTPS and how darn hard it is for news sites. So if you want to get into this, read the Wired story, because I think it does a good job of explaining why it's hard to implement for news sites and some of the sites like them, including some shopping sites.
In fact, their system admin, Zach Tolman, is going to publish a very detailed technical expose on that, exactly what they did, and it's coming within a couple of weeks. And
So there's some learning going on about how to do it, and it's been hard.
I mean, it might not just be news, right? I mean, I think this probably applies to many websites that depend on advertising, because one of the problems with these third parties is that it's the third party advertiser that does not use HTTPS, which means in order to go HTTPS, you basically have to stop using that ad service, which means a loss in revenue, which websites are willing to do.
Right. So, but we sort of have a lot of agreed upon facts about this that were not well known a year ago. The last point is what gets protected or not by encryption. And Nick's chart correctly shows there's a bunch of stuff that's the number of bits flowing through doesn't get protected by encryption. But there's two relevant things that are protected by HTTPS. And the first one is the content. Now, under the US Fourth Amendment, there's a much higher standard for content than there is for to-from information, metadata, dialing, routing, addressing, signaling information. And then the second thing that's covered by HTTPS is it stops showing you the detailed URL. You get the domain name, which is absolutely true. If the URL says www.embarrassingwebsite.com, the ISP can see the domain. But the subdomains, including the news things you went to, including the refers from your search, get covered up. A lot of people on the privacy side think that the detailed URL should also be considered content, and there's some authority for that. That gets blocked by HTTPS. So you block the content, you block the detailed URLs that gives all the clues about the detail down below. That's a win for privacy compared to not having that. And that applies to search, it applies to social networks, it applies to email, and it didn't a few years ago. So there's been a big shift in that. So for the ISPs, for those services, ISPs are not seeing most of the search, most of the social network, most of the email, which is a lot of what users live with. And so that's a change where there's protection there didn't used to be. That said, it's not pervasive. A lot of sites are not there. It's hard to do on a lot of sites if you're advertising based, but we're very different from where we were a few years ago. And I think the understanding of it's different from what it was a year ago.
Jim, what?
Sure, I can make a few. I know we're running short on time, but I'll make a few quick points. So one is that just in response to that last point, I think that's true. Increasing encryption does protect a lot of the most sensitive content of consumers' communications. That said, Title II of the Communications Act is specifically concerned with consumer privacy and protecting information that consumers consider to be private. But it is specifically concerned with metadata. There is specific statutory language about metadata. So the fact that that we are addressing some of consumers' concerns through increasing encryption, and encryption became ubiquitous, I think still would not satisfy the objectives of the law as passed by Congress. Another point is just to briefly mention that I think sometimes the volume of traffic that we talk about that is encrypted can be a misleading number because of course even if a lot of the volume could be high volume traffic because of the type of traffic it is. So, for example, streaming video creates a great volume of traffic, and if that is encrypted, then you're looking at a large percentage of the whole. Perhaps it is encrypted, but individual site visits, such as visits to webmd.com, take up a tiny fraction, or constitute a tiny fraction for each site visit of that traffic. And obviously could be much more sensitive than, for example, the facts that a person streamed in particular.
Can I just respond on that? We have a site in our report, which is a majority of the non-video traffic has been encrypted for a while now. And so the non-video got encrypted at a majority level before video came in.
I mean, I think the overall point, though, is that volume is not a very good measure. The volume of encrypted traffic is not a very good measure for sensitivity or for privacy protection. I mean, with even that domain name example that I provided earlier, just a few bits of information can reveal, a disastrous fact about a particular person that if, in the wrong hands, gets sold from an ISP to a data broker and used in various ways, could have, dire consequences. The volume,
Laura has.
Sorry.
Sorry. No, I appreciate it. I agree. And then I would also just point out that the, increasing encryption suggests that consumers are concerned about monitoring of their traffic and are actually interested in using services that are encrypted, in part in an effort to protect their online communications from monitoring. So I think, thinking about what consumers' expectations are and what consumers' desires are with respect to privacy protections, increasing encryption, in fact, underscores the need for policymakers to be paying attention to this and thinking about how they can help consumers with an effort that they are making to protect their online communications. And then I'll make one more point, which is on this discussion of what's possible versus what is plausible. I think that is an important distinction to draw. However, I also think that when we're weighing what's possible versus what's plausible, or thinking about how we can distinguish those two things and what the implications are for policy, that is a more relevant inquiry when you are looking at a situation where consumers have choice, right? When consumers have choice, then you can assume that consumers are making their choice in part based on a calculation that they might be making or that others might be helping them to make about what is actually plausible, not just what is possible, and that they are willing to assume some risk. In other words, okay, this privacy invasive practice might be possible, but it's not plausible, and as a consumer, I can choose to use this service, even knowing that X practice is possible because I think it is implausible, and I'm willing to assume that risk for the service. And this I think is one of the reasons that policymakers have drawn a distinction between telecommunications common carriers and other services that operate over our communications networks, which is that we want people to be on the network. We want there to be more nodes on the network, and we want people to be able to connect. So there is a difference that consumers don't have the choice. They don't have the ability to say, am I willing to use this service? Am I willing to go online? It's not a choice. So therefore, this idea that they might be deciding to assume some risk is I think, perhaps less relevant.
I think returning to this question about consumers not having a choice, all the CP&I rule needs to do is to require clear notice of data practices. Most consumers do have a choice among ISPs. If in fact this is a key consideration for consumers, which Laura is assuming without any empirical evidence, then consumers will be able to make an informed choice among ISPs based upon their data practices. But to presuppose that there's no choice whatsoever as to when to access the internet is simply inaccurate. You can go to a Starbucks if you want to be virtually anonymous and engage in communications. If you're afraid of some hacker stealing your information, we'll come to a different ISP.
So they're
there
not
are
the best
choices
example there. They
Many
share MAC
public-
addresses.
Many public Wi-Fi.
Yes,
Sorry. The idea that there's increased concern among consumers is, again, not empirically proven, and in fact, the HTTPS decisions are being driven by websites themselves in order to secure data. We've had on this panel, I think all of us agree that health websites should absolutely use HTTPS, and they probably will be moved to do this. Finally, if you look at the CP&I statute, there is absolutely nothing in the CP&I statute that relates to IP addresses or MAC addresses, and in fact, the CP&I statute has a big exception for directory information, which is name and address and information that's routinely used on the communications network. And the NPRM simply writes the directory information out of the rule when probably the IP address and the MAC address are exactly the same thing as directory information because they're communicated anytime you make an outbound communication on the internet. So in the end, to be faithful to the statute, the focus should be on sensitivity, and I don't think that all information that fits in the CI category right now in the rule is sensitive.
Very quick, 10 seconds.
Just a couple of points. If the argument's been made that the percentage of traffic that's encrypted doesn't matter, that what counts is some sort of count of websites that people don't ever visit. But if the issue is you want to secure the information, the amount of information that is secured is in fact the exact metric that we should be looking at. Secondly, the point was made that there's more encryption on the internet because consumers want it. Consumers aren't choosing it. Providers are giving it to them, right? And they're giving it to them because they don't want the competition when it comes to selling information that ads are based on.
Okay.
So, I mean, let's be real.
So, okay, just on the volume of traffic point, I will just say that the volume of traffic is not the same as counting the volume of information about the consumer, right? So the bits of data transferred over the network does not correspond to the bits of information about the consumer. There's a difference between those two things. So no, I don't agree.
But if you look at.
And then on the, so, sorry, on the, just because, you know, I know you've made some points, Jim, undermining the empirical support for some of the points that I've made. I'll make 3 points that I think do have empirical support. One is that, you know, responding, or I guess repeating maybe one of the points that Harlan made before, it is shown that even with the most easy to use privacy enhancing technologies, even when consumers are expressing concern about their privacy, they are unlikely to adopt things that require them to make an affirmative action, regardless, and that is regardless of how concerned they actually are about the information. So I think there is actually empirical support that defaults will be observed by consumers regardless of what their actual preferences are, and that I think is relevant to the discussion
You only
of
get to make one
opt-in
more, I'm
versus
sorry.
opt-out. One more? Okay, so
That was.
sorry.
Sorry.
But the empirical, okay,
We really-
all right, I have empirical support for 2 more
Okay.
things, but.
Well, maybe someone can ask you a question about that. Nick?
So I wanted to just sort of go back to this. I mean, I can fall into this volume question as well. I mean, let's sort of take it as a given that HTTPS deployment is increasing. Let's say that it goes from 50 to 100%. I would say that's not the end of the story. There, of course, the chart that I point out again, many of those things are orthogonal to that. But also, let's kind of go back to Peter's point about the 2 things: content and the URL that are protected by HTTPS. Again, this gets into a discussion of sort of possible versus plausible as well. But as computer scientists and security researchers, we often think as adversaries, and there's plenty of research to show that even when those pieces of information are protected by encryption, they can be inferred. So to give you one example, there's a particular attack called TLS website fingerprinting. Right? And the basic idea behind that is it is possible to figure out what web page, in certain instances, right, what web page a user is visiting solely based on, say, the size of the web page, the number of bytes transferred. Is that possible to do at scale for all sites? That's unclear. But if we're talking about trying to pinpoint whether or not a user is visiting a specific page, that may be possible even with encryption.
Cool. Okay, so we've gone longer than I anticipated, and part of that was by design because the DPI part is, in some sense, the thing we could compress and make it boring. So I want to get a real quick sense of the room and see, should we stop for questions now? Should we go through DPI and take a whole bunch of questions? You can leave as you see fit. Who has a preference? Do you want to ask questions? Just go at DPI. You want to do DPI? Or do you have burning crypto questions? Jay has a
crypto question.
Okay,
We
let's
just had a
do
very
crypto.
nice discussion about cryptography.
Yeah.
But when push comes to shove, I don't even know that it's relevant to this conversation about the SEC. Is the argument that we're going to get one day where everything will be encrypted and the ISPs won't be able to see anything? Otherwise, the argument is, well, they can't see everything, so we should regulate nothing, which seems like a very weak argument. What exactly is the policy implication of the fact that 60, 80, 90% or whatever is encrypted when they can still see a lot of significant information about their
That's a wonderful question.
You want to take it, Jim?
You want it?
Yeah, but I've also very clearly not been taking positions on what the regulation should be. I've tried to, our report tried to be empirical, and there were claims out there that ISPs saw everything, and therefore they were inescapable. And if half of it's encrypted, that's a lot less than everything. So that moved a perception to a more fact-based story about it.
Yeah, I
It's
think
still
that,
not relevant. to
but
the
I think it
purpose.
actually is relevant in that the argument in favor, from Laura and a bunch of others at CDT and others, in favor of especially heavy regulation of ISPs was that they were somehow uniquely had access to huge amounts of information that others on the internet did not. And that there was, the other argument that Laura has described is that that consumers are involuntarily surrendering personal information against their will to ISPs. Those are the two arguments to justify a proposed rule that goes beyond any other regulatory framework in the United States in terms of the amount of regulation that it would impose on one set of actors in a much larger world, much greater regulation than data brokers, for example, who sell personal information today are subject to, unless they're subject to the Fair Credit Reporting Act because they're selling information for eligibility screening. That's why I think this report is of relevance. I don't think it's centrally relevant, and you don't hear me arguing based on this that there should be no regulation, but it does put into perspective the amount of regulation that might be appropriate in this particular case.
I could respond quickly. Yeah, I will say there, I wouldn't limit the justifications to this rule to just those two. I would also say, and at least another couple. One is that the Communications Act applies specifically to Title II telecommunications providers and requires that the FCC establish strong privacy protections for subscribers of Title II telecommunications services. And this framework, the proposed framework, if it is adopted, will apply only to the Title II activities of those carriers and not to their non-Title II activities. So, all of the companies that we're talking about that are ISPs can continue to operate their advertising networks and to collect information consistent with their advertising networks and use it for those purposes under a different framework that does not apply to Title II carriers, because in that capacity they're not acting as Title II carriers. So I think that there's also the statutory basis for this, and then there's also the value exchange difference between a situation where a subscriber is paying an ISP for access to the network and providing information only incidental to that because they have to in order for the transaction to move forward, in order for their traffic to be routed through the network, they have to provide information about their communications. The provision of the information in that situation is not actually part of the value exchange. It's just provided incidentally. And that's different than a situation where a consumer has established a relationship with a business that provides a service where provision of information about the consumer is part of the value exchange and the consumer perceives that to be the case. So I will just say, I think that there are plenty of policy justifications there to be particular rules that apply to Title II providers, so I wouldn't just limit it to the two that.
Well, there's also a control difference. There is a control difference as well between ISPs and websites that you voluntarily do business with.
You also voluntarily do business with your ISP. You have a choice of ISPs in most of the country.
Some places.
We really do.
I think I'll sort of use this question also to sort of pivot into the DPI question as well, because this pervasiveness of encryption versus not really pertains to what can be seen with DPI.
So inspectability?
Inspectability, what you can see in packet payloads. And I think it's worth pointing out that statistic I mentioned at the beginning, again, right? So, the DPI in many ISPs is not pervasive, right? Less than 10%, right? But, and often in the research that I do, and it's security researchers, protocol researchers, et cetera, do, we often don't even need to look at the payloads, right? But, so I think a little bit, not to say that it's a distraction, but it's certainly not the end of the story. There's a whole list of things here that we need to consider, both in terms of how are they useful, right? As I sort of started out talking about, how are these things useful for operations and security? And those are things that we think about all the time, as well as a researcher, when we get data like this from ISPs, I'll mention that again, we get data as researchers from ISPs, or collect it ourselves, we have to think about what are the privacy risks to users of gathering this data? So I think DPI and crypto notwithstanding, even if you gather DNS or NetFlow or what have you, we think pretty hard about what kinds of things can be inferred about user behavior and activity. And I think just focusing on the crypto versus not or DPI versus not, I think neglects an important part of the story.
This is another question. It's not just deep packet inspection, it's sort of network inspection, it's flow inspection, right? Like there's things that happen in networks that don't involve necessarily putting a box that looks at flows, right? There are ways that your third-party providers, you may shunt part of your network to deliver a service that might, protect security, remove attack traffic and things like that, right?
Correct, exactly.
I don't know
So-
as much about that.
And deep, also you sort of have to ask how deep, right?
Yeah.
Does DNS, does that count as DPI? It depends on who you ask. I think another one final point on that too is to, and this goes back to your earlier question about the rulemaking. I think it's probably worth being a little more explicit about collection versus retention. From some things that I've read, I mean, it seems to be, an assumption that everything that's collected is retained. That probably depends on who you are and how much money you stand to gain by retaining it or lose. I've definitely done some research with operator types, if you will, where we've had to actually fight to get the operators not to throw away data because we think it might be useful. But oh no, that costs a lot of money to basically store that on disks and run that out of a cluster, et cetera. We're just going to chuck that. So I think another thing, it bears being explicit about, how are these things being used, who they're being shared with, how long does it need to be retained to support those uses? And by the way, are there incentives for retaining it or not?
Jim, and do we have anyone that wants to queue up a question from the audience?
I make a comment?
But let me do Jim first. Sure.
So first of all, the assertion that somehow the CP&I statute requires this is, if you read the CP&I statute on its face, it doesn't mention any of this stuff. This is an analogy that's drawn to cover a bunch of other information. Before the net neutrality order, the FTC regulated in a level playing field sort of way all internet advertising activity and required, for example, opt-in consent for use of location information, health information, series of other activities, and under Section 5 actually brought cases enforcing a bunch of these practices and called out other practices as being bad. There, as we previously discussed, there's a whole directory information exception in the CP&I statute, which maps almost precisely to IP addresses and MAC addresses, which the NPRM completely ignores because this is a proposal that's designed to go very, very far, I think, and then be subject to comment, and the commission will decide where to go. But by the same token, there is absolutely nothing in the CP&I statute that requires virtually anything in the proposed rule, and it's important to remember that. And one could argue that really there should be a new rule, new law, or a new statutory basis, and the FCC ought to forbear from applying to, in a totally different environment, a set of rules that were in part developed to promote telecom competition by competitors in the local market, not just to protect privacy, and think about, in a broader way, about how this ought to be approached. But there's no way that the statute requires this particular result if you read it on its face. In terms of value exchange, it's also important to understand that ISPs get a significant amount of revenue from subscription customers and are incentivized not to be creepy because they could lose those customers. Whereas there are a whole lot of other players on the internet, if you take a Google, they've got a very important customer relationship. There are a whole bunch of other players who have no relationship whatsoever with consumers and don't have the market disincentive to being aggressive in their information practices. And that's also, I think, missing from the value exchange analysis that Laura's many really good debating points included in putting forward.
And I really have to apologize to the internet if you're hearing that hammering. It's ongoing construction. We told them to stop, but apparently they did not listen. And we'll go Bob, and then Richard, and then I believe Peter's going to have the last word because we're approaching time.
I just wanted to respond to the argument that this is the only area of privacy law where a proposal singles out one set of players and ignores the others. That's not true. HIPAA covers hospitals and insurers. There are lots of people who process health data who are not subject to HIPAA. The Privacy Act covers federal agencies and some federal contractors. It does not cover federal grantees. FERPA covers schools.
Bob, that's not what I said. So let's just be clear. The extent of regulation, particularly with regard to first-party advertising, for ISPs goes beyond even what HIPAA requires of healthcare providers when they are dealing entirely with sensitive information. And that's what's unusual.
Well, the point is just that privacy laws cover some players and not other players, and there's no difference here than there is with
The
other.
question is, what should the laws say and how far
That's a
should they
different
go?
issue.
Right, and that was my point.
Okay, Richard and Peter, you have the last word.
Well, and that's the thing, if the argument is that it's necessary for the FCC to discriminate against ISPs and in favor of ad brokers and data brokers because of Title II, doesn't that suggest that maybe Title II is not the appropriate framework to use in the first place?
First, I want to thank CDT and Joe for having this discussion. I do think the technical understanding, as for instance illustrated on this chart, is a long way from where we were a year ago. And so a bunch of arguments that were on the table are now off the table because the facts are better understood. So I think that's a good thing for the FCC to have that as a basis for whatever they decide to do. They'll make whatever decision in their wisdom they make, but whatever. I mean, it will. It's like any other government agency, right? Any crazy HIPAA regulators, or whoever does this. Okay, so the last point I wanted to make is looking at the chart here and the different kinds of flow. Historically, in the advertising markets where people spend money, there's been a lot of money spent on advertising around content, for instance, scanning emails, a lot of money and search, and a lot of money spent on detailed URLs, which is how online behavioral advertising mostly goes. The other kinds of data here, by and large, have not been the focus of big dollar advertising, at least that I've been able to determine. And so it may be going forward that they will be. It may be that there's a richness of data here that will develop. But any richness of data that happens here will be in competition with ad dollars that can be based on content from other sources or on detailed URLs from other sources. So part of thinking about what's the realistic, scary scenarios around advertising and data usage should look at whether these are the kinds of data that will support those business models. We haven't really had time to discuss that here, but I think that's part of what you want to figure out if you want to see how risky this stuff is.
So thank you. That was a breakneck hybrid panel. I really appreciate everyone coming. Maybe we'll do a reprise after when the reply comment period is down and get some of the same faces and maybe some different ones, and I hope to see some of you in the audience up here. Thanks so much. Thanks to Princeton for sponsoring this, and please stick around and there's probably some food left. Thank you all. And please thank our panel.
Yes.
Well, you were very friendly.
I don't like. I guess I feel like.
No, I mean you were clarified a lot of things. So despite being a useless Ivy League academic, you actually do have value to follow.
I have a picture or push to the extent to which I strive for useful data from this way to have utilities. But that's part of the code.
What kind of issues, ISPs and their vendors have with support for them?
Yeah, that would be interesting.
It's a really problematic environment.
No doubt. I'm familiar with the OpenWRT code base, so we use it quite a bit.
Yeah, I don't think that's really the end of the story. I mean, the people that I work for, they just got a big chunk of code from Broadcom.
Yeah.
And did the minimum customization that they had to, and shipped it out the door without really knowing, what was inside. And they got in trouble because they did make some changes that they didn't share the way they were supposed to, under the license. And they did a bunch of really bonehead things. One of the customers wanted the Wi-Fi to ship with security turned on.
Maybe not necessarily.
So they decided the security they should use as well. And they generated a unique web feed.
Oh, yeah. Like, who could guess? Right. If you were crazy, you would know that.
But even then, they haven't getting Microsoft certification because at the time Microsoft required the default mode of all and they, you know, they took tons of negotiations with Microsoft to get away with that.
Yeah, no, it's certainly not a fear setting. A lot of people do it. Right? That's what advertising is. That's what a lot of these businesses are. It's what can we guess about consumers in some cases? Depending on how much data we have, we might have a better idea, much less. But it depends on, I mean, oftentimes the issue here too is that the data that's collected loses its context from where it came from. So it might not be easy for a downstream data user to know, well, you know, what can I understand about this particular inference, right? So for example, ISP data goes to a data broker puts the user in a marketing segment. This is, you know,
But that data represents all the users of the account. Sure. It can be a lot more.
Okay, so like you have a vulnerable household, right? It might not be an issue. But then, okay, so what do you advertise
people are using
that bucket? I mean, people will advertise and will, regardless of what right. But data users won't be able to gauge quality, right? They'll buy a consumer segment.
Because you can see what they know, but you don't know what they get, and you don't know what
Yeah, Netflix can't figure out what kind of movies I like. Been a Netflix customer for 10 years, and that's like their, you know, the reason they crunch all that data is to try to recommend movies that you're going to like. They're like almost always wrong. They can't get the answer out of it.
It's not magic. You can't.
Huh?
You cannot always presume innocence. You can say, oh, we just want to show you better movies.
But I mean, they can't even do that. So I don't know what they're whatever they're doing with that information. Georgetown, right? Oh, dude, yeah.
I don't think I got it.
And it's our IEEE Internet Policy Lady. She's like the queen of the IEEE Internet Policy Lady.
Princeton.
IEEE Princess Leia.
Thank you very much.